Brian did put in the chat. He said, speaking of Apple Video, what happened to Aperture, and how do you move to photos? I don't need Photoshop. It's too steep of a learning curve for my needs. What do you guys suggest? And I would say I actually still use Aperture, but I know Lightroom is the way to go, right, Dave?
Yeah, Lightroom's the way to go. Again, this is Apple's commitment level to their software.
Salty.
Is that they created the Final Cut Pro, and they created Motion, which is their answer to After Effects, and people invested in it and they started doing stuff. They created Aperture, which basically is Adobe Lightroom, but it's the Mac. It's their answer to Lightroom, which lets you develop all the your photographs. Especially if you shoot in RAW, it's a digital darkroom. It's great. It's wonderful. But they got bored with it and just walked away from it.
And he forgot
and compressor. Yeah, they actually, and compressor was their answer to Adobe Media Encoder. And I know networks that built custom scripting and all this kind of stuff for compressor to do all kinds of great stuff, to take one source and generate all kinds of stuff and go put it way over here and store another one over here and upload it to this. Dump in tons of metadata. Just all kinds of great stuff like that, and basically had to start all over because Apple went, and that attitude is why I always tell everybody, if you're going to do anything beyond playing around, then get into the Adobe suite, and always use the Adobe suite because they've been around. Guys, Photoshop was the guts of Photoshop was invented back in like 1977.
Didn't they just have their 30th anniversary of Photoshop?
Officially of Photoshop, but Noel, what's his face, was working for Industrial Light and Magic, and
Thomas Knoll.
Huh? Thomas?
Was it Thomas Knoll?
No, that's Thomas Dolby. Anyway,
No,
John Knoll. It's John
Knoll, yes.
So John Knoll was working for Industrial Light and Magic, and started creating Photoshop basically as a tool for them. And then, eventually it all spun off, and now it's what we see today. So anyway, I think you can still install Aperture. I think you still have. There's like an old version sitting out there.
I think it's still available on the App Store, actually.
Okay, good. So stick with it. They're not going to be developing it anymore, I don't think. Maybe some like little patches or something like that, but I don't think you're going to be seeing Aperture 15 or anything like that. But you may want to check around and see if there is a okay. So the way that Lightroom handles it is they have a catalog, and that catalog has just tons of metadata. Okay, they don't actually take to my knowledge, they don't take your actual file from point A on the hard drive and encapsulate it into their catalog. At least when I set mine up, I said, if that's an option, I always tell people don't ever do that, because if that file becomes corrupt, you're screwed.
Correction: Aperture is still not available. Only Motion and Compressor.
All right. So if you still have Aperture, if you still have the app file or something, see if there's some sort of a way. If I don't know if Aperture takes your file and dumps it into this proprietary encapsulated thing like Final Cut does.
Yeah, right? It does it in a library, but if you don't have Aperture anymore, Photos will read that library.
It will read that library?
Yeah.
Great. That's fantastic. Using Photos, again, it's a proprietary system. It's not cross-platform, so you are locking yourself in. If you use Lightroom, and you can get the Photoshop Lightroom package or whatever for like $10 a month or something like that. It's not a huge deal.
Yeah, that's what I did for a long time. It was only like $12 including taxes.
Yeah, exactly. So But one of the options that you have when you're setting up Lightroom, and you can change it at any time, is to actually leave your files where you put them. So you can go and store your files. You can go put it in the 2019, our church, whatever, Baptist church or whatever, and then 2019 photos, and then break things up, youth, and however you want to organize and file your stuff so that you can easily back it up and duplicate it and do all that sort of stuff, manage your files and all that, and it all stays there. But of course, all the stuff that is done in Lightroom is all non-destructive. It uses metadata files that will be basically, you'll see, my great picture, .jpeg or .psd or raw or whatever, DNG or whatever. You'll see that. But then underneath it, you'll see an attached like XMP file, basically a metadata file that basically instructs Lightroom and says, hey, when you view this image, here's a huge list of stuff to do before you show it to the guy. And that's the exposure compensation, the sharpening, the doing all that sort of stuff. And so it's all non-destructive. You can just export out a JPEG or edit in Photoshop, and save a version out of there, all that kind of stuff. It's great. So I want to encourage you to use that. But thanks, Justin. If it does punch it out, or Photoshop does, Photos does read it and stuff, then you haven't lost anything. As long as
so two things. Yes, Photos reads Aperture. Now it doesn't. I don't know. He asked if Photos reads Aperture files. It reads the Aperture library. I just opened up my Photos app, and it says library. Okay. Well, it's too late now. It's already preparing the library. But sorry, and I can't do anything. It's basically importing the app. But anyways, I use Aperture. I still use Aperture, but I won't for long because I'm sure they're not updating the new cameras. But yeah, all I did was I opened up Aperture. You can go to File, Import, and you can find the Aperture library, and it will bring it into your folders as another library. Yeah.
You opened up Photos. You didn't open up Aperture.
Yeah, Photos. Sorry, Photos, File, Import, and then you can choose your Aperture library. Two questions, Dave. First, Brian has a follow-up question. Can you get Lightroom without Photoshop? And maybe you want to talk just for a split second about raw therapy that we talked about on the show.
Raw therapy?
The Lightroom open source alternative.
Oh my gosh. I haven't played with that since we originally talked about it.
You talked about it.
I know. But God, I play with it because I don't use it. It's not part of my workflow.
Yeah. Okay. So I was just saying maybe it's
raw therapy. Thank you.
Raw therapy in the chat.
Hang on a sec.
That may get you what you know. Yeah, Chris said Photoshop and Lightroom is $12 a month. He said totally worth it. I don't know if you can buy Lightroom by itself. I know they have
I'm looking right now, but I understand that you may not be a strong Photoshop user, Brian, but even just having that accessibility is great because there's a lot of, you may get a file, you may be asked to do a graphic or something, and they may give you a file and it's actually a PSD, and just to be able to have that access to Photoshop is really
well. Can Photoshop read RAW?
Yes.
Yeah, of course. It has the raw importer.
Okay.
Yeah, it's
And my thing is like you want to like for me when I do. I say event photography. I'm no pro. Okay. When I do a bunch of stuff at the church, I like to see the library. I like basically my workflow is go through and get rid of everything that looks bad. Go through and rate things 1 to 5, and then I go through and I ditch things less than 3, or I archive them, and then I go through and I pick and then I do a quick edit, and then I pick my top 5 that's going to be published, and then I do the deep edit, which I might open in Photoshop. Right. That's for me what Lightroom is for.
Right.
Yeah. I hardly ever use Photoshop. When I had that package before I got this job, I would use Photoshop maybe for my deep stuff, but that was rare. It was probably 90-10 Lightroom versus Photoshop. You can do everything on Lightroom.
Yeah,
unless you need to take in something. Unless you need to do like a clone, and clone something out.
Right.
But you can fix blemishes. You can fix.
You can do your sharpening, your loom adjustments.
Yeah, it's a very strong. It's got curves. It's got saturation. It's got levels. I mean, the development tools, once I finally got into the development tools of the Lightroom, I stopped using Photoshop altogether.
Yeah, you don't have to use, and I will actually open up a JPEG in Photoshop, and then I'll go to the filters and use the Lightroom raw filter to go in and treat it like I was in Lightroom. Here's the deal on the pricing. You can get the photography plan, which is $9.99 a month. Okay, so $10. Yep. So $10 a month. It includes Lightroom CC, Lightroom Classic CC. There's a ton of similarities. There are some differences. You get your own portfolio website and social media tools. I don't ever use that. And you get 20 gigs of cloud storage, okay, which is about 4,000 JPEGs. Or you can get the Lightroom CC plan, which is $10 a month, and it includes Lightroom CC, the same portfolio website garbage, and a terabyte of Adobe Cloud storage. Generally, and that's about 20,000 raw DSLR images if you were doing that. Okay. I don't use Adobe Cloud for anything other than the content of my libraries, which Adobe lets you have common libraries that you share between the apps. So, in fact, if you want, I'll give you a quick demo of that. So I don't just blow out the stuff. My online storage, my cloud storage of photos and all that other stuff is back and forth between, a 1 terabyte Dropbox account and a 2 terabyte Google Drive account. So having to go to Adobe Creative Cloud to find a photo or so, I don't do that. I don't sit on my iPad and do my photo editing. I don't make thumbnails on my iPad. I don't do anything like that. I sit down at my laptop or my Surface Pro or my machine here in creator mode and make my content. So either way, you're going to pay $10 a month. I say get Photoshop. A lot of people are really intimidated by Photoshop. If you understand a handful of basics, you don't need to be intimidated by Photoshop. Mm-hmm. Okay? Everybody freaks out because there's a million things. I understand that. I understand that completely. But there's a handful of very basic concepts. And I can teach you those in 5 minutes. If you get that, then you can start playing around with Photoshop and become someone who can come up with some really cool stuff.
Here's a good question to prove that point, Dave. How much percentage would you say you use of Photoshop?
With my graphic design, any graphic work, I do everything in Photoshop.
But but the percentage of usage of Photoshop, if you knew how to do everything, it's 100%.
Oh, out of its total tool set, how much of it do I use? The things I use most are layers, obviously, because you can have multiple pieces that you can move around on layers, just like if you were sitting down with an art board, back into, I don't know how old you are, Brian. I can't see you. I just see your name. But, when I was in school and took art classes and stuff, we had an art board, and we would do these projects where we cut stuff out from the magazine, put it there, and then we would stencil and cut out some text, and we would, do a composite. So layers laying on top of each other to create a final image that you look at, right? So same thing with Photoshop. I use layers I have layer on a text on a layer. I've got Justin on one layer. I've got me on another layer. I've got a background on another layer. Okay. I use the lasso tool to cut out stuff. So like if I want to separate myself from the background or something, I will sit there with the lasso tool. I use the magnetic lasso tool, which basically looks at the contrast between the area that you've started at and the area on this side, the area on that side. And basically, if you just slowly go around, it just basically, highlights it and cuts it out for you. And I use masking. And what masking is it's a non-destructive way to basically isolate something and have nothing but transparency in other areas of your image. It's a really easy way to do. If you ever watched any of the old Star Wars behind the scenes stuff where they showed, with A New Hope, or Empire Strikes Back, how they would, make the TIE fighters fly or something. And you saw those things where they had the TIE fighter on a blue screen and they shot that. Then they did a pass where it was the TIE fighter was black like a silhouette and everything else was whitened out. Then everything, the TIE fighter was white and everything else was blackened out. And that's how they were able to do the, what do they call it? Oh my gosh, what's it's an old term. Anyway, where they would superimpose stuff on top of each other and do all that. That's how you do it, except it's literally painting out the area that I don't want, so I could like take Justin and I could put him in mask mode and then take black paint and basically start erasing everything I don't want and stuff. But if I ever wanted it back, then I would just paint white and it would reveal it. I mean, so it's a handful of tools that I use on a regular basis out of the myriad of really deep tools. I don't do hardly any of the vector stuff in there. I don't do a whole bunch of, drawing spline curves and stuff that you would do in Illustrator. I don't do stuff like that. But for me, it's an indispensable tool as a creator.